Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's event, Insights about the Future for Internal Combustion Engines Powering Passenger Vehicles in the U.S. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. During this event, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. To ask a question at any time, please submit your question using the Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to ask questions at any time. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. This event is being recorded. The recording and presentation will be available on the Engine Technology Forum's website shortly after the live event. I would now like to introduce our first speaker, Alan Schaefer, who's the Executive Director of the Engine Technology Forum. Alan?
Great. Thank you very much, Josie, and let me extend my welcome to everyone. Thank you for taking some time to be with us today for this virtual event, one of a series that we have underway this year. Today's is going to be a focus on what the future is for internal combustion engines in light-duty vehicles here in the U.S. And we'll get into that in just a moment. Let me just share a few words quickly about this organization. The Engine Technology Forum was established last year after having a good 23 years as the Diesel Technology Forum. And this is a little bit about us and the work that we do. And I want to thank our member companies for their support, which makes today's event possible. And those are all listed here on the screen. As we begin to discuss this topic today on light-duty vehicles, I wanted to start maybe with a little stage setting and help everyone visualize at least how we think of the challenge we have ahead of us in terms of approaching the clean energy future. And that is one of inclusivity, where we have a range of fuels and technologies that are going to be serving different aspects of our economy and population in the years to come. And internal combustion engines being part of that, at the very least, the fact that they serve such a significant role throughout every aspect of our global economy today, and any kind of switch to alternatives is likely to be uneven and occur in different time frames and periods in different sectors, including light duty. We happen to work in all these sectors and look at the range of fuels that are involved here as well, both the traditional fossil-based fuels as well as renewable fuels, and probably some fuels that we are not fully experienced with yet, such as e-fuels. But nonetheless, internal combustion engines do play a significant role throughout our global economy. And we like to think of the challenge that we have ahead of us as one that is requiring many solutions. It is not a simple problem that can be solved with one solution, whatever fuel or technology that might be. We think that the internal combustion engine still has plenty of useful life left, and it has a great opportunity to contribute substantially to helping reduce greenhouse gas and other emissions in the years ahead. We are delighted today to begin to take a deeper look at this topic with the release of our new white paper shown here on the screen. And you can download this paper at the bottom of your screen in the resources section of the Zoom toolbar. So we encourage you to pull that down and take a look at it. It's also featured on the Engine Technology Forum website under the uses section for passenger vehicles. But it is a paper that we're just releasing this morning. So please take a look at that. And today's discussion is going to be modeled largely on that paper. And so we're delighted to have with us here the author, Alan Baum, the principal of Baum & Associates. Alan has been an analyst in the auto industry for many decades now and has great expansive view of the market forces, all the intricacies and nuances that impact automotive manufacturing and the decisions that manufacturers make to produce their products. So welcome, Alan, and we're delighted to have you with us. I wanted to just, before we jump right into that and your sharing of your insights on this topic, Alan. I just thought that it might be appropriate today, just looking at the news in the last few weeks, to use this as kind of a stage setting opportunity. And we see the great challenge of what's going on in the industry relative to personal mobility. And it is nothing short of extraordinary from a whole variety of different perspectives, whether it's the acceptance of new technologies or the lack of support or a disagreement about current regulatory policy coming from states and others. We have really a very dynamic situation, very complicated, lots of moving parts, and the stakes, of course, are very high for both manufacturers, consumers, and overall society in terms of making progress towards a cleaner environment and reduced emissions. So I thought this might be a way to kind of get us all in the mood for what is about to come. And this discussion will touch on all of these different kind of topics. And so with that, I want to kind of jump right in here. We'll get Alan, like to invite you. This is an opportunity to kind of level set everyone kind of on where we are. And I just will point out before you begin, Alan, we do have some resources available that address some of these issues that are available on our website, enginetechforum.org. And these are featured here on the right-hand side of this slide. And so you can access those there at any time. But with that, let me welcome you, Alan, to the program here, and look forward to your getting us started. You know, what is the current state of play relative to the light-duty vehicle market in the U.S.?
Well, Alan, thank you very much. Obviously, complexity and choice and some question of the way forward, and I think really that's the reason that you asked me to do this kind of work and try to put this into context, because really one of the biggest problems is kind of the bandwagon effect that happens when a certain idea gets promulgated. That's obviously true in a lot of cases, but it's also true in the discussion we're talking about today. And those recent headlines that you showed are an example of that. What I'm going to do, first of all, is just mention just a couple of really big areas of discussion, and then I'll hit each of them a little more detailed as we go forward. So if we could go to the next slide. Okay, well, let me actually do, before I get into the slide itself, get into these topics. First of all, regulation is obviously a huge issue here. And the regulations, at least from the EPA and NHTSA, are technology agnostic. And what I mean by that is they can be, the regulations can be met in a variety of ways. And that's critical, because different companies and different consumers have different ideas about how they want to meet their, in the case of the companies, their sales needs, and in the case of the consumers, what they drive. And we'll talk about that. And therefore, there's tremendous variance across automakers, which we'll also deal with. The regulations, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, have been softened from their original design, and that's important as well, particularly for the ICE side of things. And vehicle age is yet another issue, and we'll talk more about that coming forward, about not just what's being sold today, but the overall state of the fleet. And obviously, there's a huge overhang of what's already in the market, and that will continue. The BEV market, which we're going to talk about throughout this presentation, is maturing, still growing, and maybe that's an opportunity to go to the slide we're on right now. You see the blue bar, which represents the volumes, and those volumes are on the left, whereas the blue line is the share. And you see that growing from the 2020 to 2023 period. The same thing is true for PHEVs, plug-in hybrids, in a lesser way, and again, we'll talk more about that. The plug-in hybrids are critical, of course, because they have an ICE engine in them. although it typically is a smaller engine because of the battery, which is again smaller than the BEVs, since they're two methods of propulsion. And then finally, the hybrids. These are when I say hybrid, I mean regular hybrid. Think Toyota Prius, Toyota Camry, a variety of vehicles, and there's a lot of discussion in the market now about PHEVs and hybrids increasing. We'll talk more about that. But again, if you think of the PHEVs and hybrids, obviously both have an ICE engine, as well as when we say ICE, we mean not having a hybrid or a PHEV. But again, you see the hybrid share growing dramatically, and that will continue to do so. We will talk more about that. And then the kind of scene setter is the U.S. versus other markets. We obviously don't live in a vacuum. The companies are global companies and have ideas about what they want to do. Returning to the slide, you see these percentages. What you don't see, of course, is the other 75% or 80%, which are the ICEs that are not hybrids, not PHEVs, and then, of course, the BEVs. So again, thinking about the importance of the ICE vehicles, obviously in their overall volume in the market, but even within their sales year over year, and in the most current years, obviously that ICE market is dramatic in terms of its share, in terms of its impact, and of course the ICE market is not sitting still. Again, we'll talk more about that in terms of the changes that are being implemented in those vehicles in order to meet the regulations that I discussed very briefly. So when we talk about, and then returning to one more thing with respect to the BEV market, we're going to talk more about cost issues, which of course leads to pricing issues, manufacturing problems, dealers who are, to put it nicely, less than aggressive on sales of some of these vehicles, consumer concerns, and then which in significantly range and charging anxiety, all of which we will talk about. If you could, yeah.
Yeah, and Alan, one of the things that just comes to mind for me as you set this up, our current state of play here is, I think the choice of the word used, complexity, is significant and just so appropriate. The other thing that comes to mind for me is looking at this chart. This represents just 4 years. We're 4 years into this level of transition here, which began, I guess, in earnest, you could say, around 2020, perhaps a bit before, and certainly hybrids have been around well before that. But in this short, compact period of time, the amount of change and new technology entering this industry is just nothing short of phenomenal. It's just mind-boggling, really.
And you know, it's interesting because some of those headlines you showed talked about how the various groups were decrying the regulations and lawsuits, etc. Let's put the flip side of that. What the industry, in fact, has achieved on, again, not just the hybrids, the BEVs, and the PHEVs, but on the ICE side, and the fact that that's not done. You know, if we're going to reach extremely low levels of emissions, yes, we're going to increase BEV share. But the ability of PHEVs, hybrids, and ICE vehicles to improve fuel economy is not done. It's not just a question of moving from ICE to PHEV to hybrid. It's within ICE, and in part, the regulatory easing, if you will, of the final regulations enabled that.
Mm-hmm.
So we can.
Well, this is a great look at the current state of play, and you know, things change in a heartbeat in this industry, and that is particularly true in recent times. And I think one of the sections of the paper we have is that a new narrative is here, and maybe that's a way to kind of kick off this next part of the discussion. What's happened here? Where are we?
Well, the focus has been on the new technologies and obviously the BEVs, and we had a series of early adopters. And obviously Tesla captured a lot of them, and those early adopters were somewhat forgiving in the sense that the cost of vehicles were less of an issue, perhaps even some reliability issues. Fit and finish, for example, on early Teslas was not exactly the high end, but we're now getting to the next issue of moving from those early adopters on BEVs to the mainstream. And that's a real different situation. Before I go with this graph, I've got some other issues that we've in the paper we talked about with respect to this new narrative. And part of the issue, the reason that the numbers in the previous slide were not were on the lower level as opposed to being dominant, we're getting over concerns about the new technology, specifically the BEVs and the PHEVs. Frankly, the industry has underperformed in putting these vehicles out there. Based upon what the plans were 3 years ago, a lot of the idea was, well, the automakers, particularly the mainstream automakers, they know how to make cars, and boy, just wait until those automakers have their crack at BEVs, and they're gonna crank them out. They're gonna be at a lower cost, and therefore the volumes are going to be huge. Well, that kind of fell short. There have been some significant problems with both the automakers and some of their suppliers, and that has led to higher cost and therefore higher prices, which of course led to declines in consumer uptake. In addition, the UAW contract, while not a direct issue with respect to these vehicles, was a financial issue that the industry, was, and obviously we're talking here about the Detroit Three, Stellantis, GM, and Ford, is looking to say to Wall Street, well, look, we know that we're paying a little bit more than we anticipated to the UAW over these next few years. We still want you to support us. We want you to buy our stock. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to pull back a little bit on our investments. And of course, many of the investments that are being talked about in this current time period are the BEVs, PHEVs, et cetera. And so there's been a pullback. I mentioned the softer regulations, the ability to meet those regulations in a variety of ways. And at this point, scale is still with the ICEs. And what I mean by that is, the volumes of the BEVs and PHEVs are still quite modest. And that has led, like I said, to pricing and cost and pricing problems. The reverse, of course, is true with ICEs, and for that matter, hybrids, which are obviously built off of ICEs. And so the scale is still there, meaning that the cost of those vehicles is still quite competitive. And so that is what we've seen is investment pushed back, particularly with certain automakers like Ford and GM, for example, each pushing back the launch of new plants for their pickup BEVs. And so that has kind of changed the scenery, if you will. Now, I want to move now to the graph here, this vehicles in operation. Unlike the previous graph, which was sales in a particular year, this is more of a cumulative look at the fleet. and it's based upon vehicles in operation at any point in time and the split between these various types. And again, you need to think about what's not on this chart. It's the other 96 to 97% of the market, which are the ICE vehicles. Vehicles in operation is based upon how long the typical vehicle is in service. The average age is about 12 and a half years. And so that means that there are still vehicles that are 20, 25 years old, obviously not a lot of them. But the point being, as we move forward, it's going to take a long time for that fleet to turn over, particularly if the BEV and PHEV volumes are so modest. And as you see, when you look at it, not from the perspective of individual sales in a year, but over a long period of time that encompasses what's currently on our roads today, obviously the ICE piece is overwhelming, which means that it's critical that the vehicles that are in operation, including the ones sold over the next several years, improve their fuel economy and reduce their emissions. And the regulations that we talked about from the EPA and NHTSA, in fact, require that, albeit at a somewhat lesser level than was originally proposed. So the point being that the ICE vehicles, and I include the regular hybrids in that category as well, since they obviously rely upon that ICE engine, are the means to that end. So that's a key issue. If we could move to the next slide.
One of the things I wanted to just jump in here, maybe, and just a question for you, going back to the sort of the manufacturers and sort of how they address these issues and work with unions and other things and negotiating labor contracts. The other thing I think that maybe we've lost sight of a little bit as we look at, even another layer of complexity on this, and that is the impact of the pandemic. Because a lot of this, I mean, we're talking about 2020 through 2024, 23, let's say, a lot of that was happening really right in the thick of things. And I'd be curious from your perspective, to what extent do you feel like the pandemic and the related supply chain issues, really serve to kind of dampen down the ability of manufacturers to produce advanced electric vehicles and other things to take advantage of that market? Do you think that had a big impact?
Well, it had a couple of issues. One was, development of new BEVs and PHEVs was obviously well underway during the pandemic, and everybody said, "Oh, we've done such a wonderful job of moving everybody home and being able to take care of managing our companies, and in the case of the auto companies, managing product development." But there were holes there. And the supply chain obviously was the most significant part of it for the short term, but in the longer term, there were delays in getting that work done. And yes, you can use a variety of use system issues over electronic sources, but there still needs to be issues done in person with testing and that kind of thing. And we lost some of that during the pandemic. And then, of course, the other thing was the inflation that occurred due to the supply chain problems, increased cost across the industry, not just for consumers, but for companies as well. And that goes back to what I was talking about specifically in the UAW case of appealing to Wall Street. But it's been more generic than that, in the sense that the automakers are generally not rewarded by Wall Street. Wall Street doesn't like car companies because they're very cash intensive. And in general, not as profitable as, for example, tech companies, where their cost structure is completely different. So there's an issue there of trying to cut costs, and obviously the result, ameliorated by the emissions regulations softening, is to push back some of those investments.
Mhm.
Looking, this is actually a continuation of the slide you saw a few minutes ago, of the share of and volumes of BEVs, PHEVs, and hybrids. And you see that the BEV volumes are not, uh, again, looking back at the prevailing press idea that the whole market is crashing. No, it's not. But it is going at a lower level than some of the automakers themselves, and certainly some of the commentators and analysts had said. If you look at what was discussed with the regulatory, when it was put out a year ago, there was talk about 50 to 60% in the 2030s. Now, this slide doesn't go that far out, but these volumes, BEVs are still significant. I should note the PHEV and the hybrid shares are conservative, and what I mean by that is, the industry has turned more recently to PHEVs and hybrids as they backed away from BEVs. The problem is a lot of the automakers kind of, you know foreclosed on that possibility of the PHEVs and hybrids, because they said we're going all out into BEVs. And the obvious example of that would be General Motors. General Motors a few years ago said we don't see the value in having two powertrains in a vehicle. It adds cost, and we're going all in on BEVs. Well, obviously they've come off of that, in part because of sales issues, in part because of their own issues in terms of producing these vehicles at the volume and cost that they had initially planned, and third reason being, and perhaps the most important, and that is the consumer views. Now, those consumer views are locked in with respect to the price and the cost, and as I mentioned earlier, the range and charger anxiety. I guess the purpose of this slide is to say, yes, ICE and hybrids have a huge role now and going forward, but we can't say that BEVs are stuck at 7% of the market, for example. Obviously, this graph belies that. As I said, the PHEVs and the hybrids are both understated because of this issue of moving to these products after not being focused upon them by many automakers. Obviously, Toyota has been and will continue to be the hybrid king. They are in their fifth generation of hybrid propulsion development, and they're leaders in the industry, and it's obviously very profitable for them. Hyundai Kia is another. Actually, in that case, they're all over the propulsion. They're split, is what I should say, across the various types. Ford is focused more so on hybrids than some of its competitors. And GM, for example, has announced that their first PHEV back in the American market. They do sell PHEVs outside of the U.S., outside of North America. It will take them a little while to get it back into their factory system and the supply chain, et cetera. So it will be early 2027 when their PHEVs return to the market. Most automakers have modest volumes in some of these categories, but as I said, that's changing. And so I want to emphasize, for the fourth time I think I've said on this slide, that these PHEV and hybrid numbers are understated and will increase. This is obviously from a forecast that I put out quarterly on the electrified vehicle market. And so there's obviously a lot of detail behind this.
Great.
Okay, if we could move forward.
Yeah, well, that is a great look at the plug-in hybrid, electric vehicle, battery electric vehicle, hybrid vehicle situation there. But we know, as you suggested earlier, that not only are manufacturers producing some of these new products, new fuels and powertrain system propulsion systems, maybe I should say, but they're also continuing to invest in internal combustion engines. And maybe share a few insights with us about that.
Yeah, as I mentioned, it's critical for a number of reasons. The sheer volume of ICE vehicles in the market, and that will continue to go into the market as new sales. And in that vein, to meet regulatory requirements, just because the regulatory requirements were softened doesn't mean that they're not challenging and that there's not a requirement for improvement. There is, and it's dramatic. And obviously, if you're going to have ICE vehicles as 70% of the market in the near and midterm future, you've got to have that improvement. And there are a couple of examples. At Stellantis, for example, the Hurricane family of engines is replacing what was their earlier efforts called the Pentastar. And obviously that's been in play for some time. We've seen small displacement Hurricane engines in some of their vehicles. They're now putting a six-cylinder Hurricane into a variety of vehicles, including their Jeep products and their Ram products, which obviously are the key divisions in terms of volume and profit, et cetera, for their products. And of course, the whole idea is to make the consumer happy so that they'll be interested in buying those vehicles. And so that's occurring. The Ford EcoBoost engines are of somewhat previous vintage, but they are continue to be absolutely critical to the ICE sales, and they've continued to improve. The same thing is, of course, occurring at GM with its move to more efficient ICE engines. And it's funny. A couple 3 years ago, everybody was bragging about how this is the last last update to ICE engine families, that there won't be all new engines coming because everything's gonna be BEV. Well, obviously that's not the way the world has worked, and it was not the way that was working at the automakers themselves. They didn't have that view either. And so, for example, at GM in the diesel side, we've just seen a new Duramax, or I should say updates to the Duramax, which is used in the large pickups and large SUVs at the top of their vehicle operation. And then I mentioned briefly a minute ago Hyundai, which has been and continues to be kind of a bellwether of a mixed strategy across the board of BEVs, of PHEVs, of hybrids, and of ICE. And Hyundai, and of course this includes Kia and Genesis, have moved from what was viewed perhaps by the consumer as a more entry level set of products, to one that they've obviously tried to move up the market to higher profits. But for purposes of this discussion, they are now serving more consumers in more segments, and multiple propulsion types. I was at the New York Auto Show in March, and they really showed that broad range of products at the show, and got a lot of very positive press about it.
But so we know the technology has to keep moving forward of all kinds, and certainly I think one of the things I've learned working with the manufacturers over the years is that they're going to produce products to serve their customers today and also serve them into the future. And I think that's, really takes us forward because our paper does get into some of the challenges that folks have faced with the transition to battery electric vehicles. And certainly that has been dominating the news, I would say, maybe oversubscribed in some ways that maybe paints a picture that's worse than it is some days for sure. But there are some real issues there, and your analysis in your paper looks at this a little bit more. Maybe share some insights on that with us.
Well, I kind of highlighted this in bullet points at the beginning of the discussion. Perhaps I can add a few sentences to each, if you will. This production issue of not being able to produce at the levels that they had planned, and that has been a key problem for a number of automakers. I mentioned GM and Ford having some issues with batteries, with their supply chain, etc. GM, for example, this year is, as we speak, really, the Blazer, the Equinox, the Silverado, all of them on what they call their Ultium platform. They were a couple of those vehicles were planned actually for late last year, and they had some both production and feature issue problems, some software concerns. The Cadillac Lyriq was launched a couple of years ago, but the volumes were pretty modest because they had some issues with the vehicle, and they held them. That has now been solved, and so we're seeing the GM volumes start to increase. But the other side of that, of course, is cost. And the volumes are not where they expected them to be, nor where the consumer or the regulators or the press expected them to be. And then the result becomes if the cost, the auto industry is a scale industry. And if you don't have scale, then you can't amortize your cost. And so you have to make a decision. If your volume is low, do you take the hit and sell at a price that was more in line with higher volume, or do you take that cost into account and price the vehicle higher? And what we're seeing in the BEV case is the idea that the early volumes or early versions of a vehicle are the high end, in part to appeal to that early buyer, and then we get to the mainstream buyer. And of course, that mainstream buyer wants to see the cost come down. Otherwise, they're not going to purchase the vehicle. And the result, of course, is sales are lower than expected. And we're obviously going to see that, as I mentioned earlier, with the Ford F-150 Lightning and the GM Silverado and Sierra EVs, both of which are all in production now, with the exception of the Sierra. That's coming real soon. But the volume is going to be more modest because the dedicated plants have been delayed. So we're talking in the case of Ford, they're still making them at a Dearborn plant that will transfer to their new plant in Tennessee, but later than expected. And the same is with GM. They're building them in Detroit. Eventually, that will translate or transfer not completely, but in part to Orion, nearby in Michigan, where the volumes will be higher. So the other thing that this slide mentions is range and charger anxiety. I think we mentioned earlier a significant share of customers don't have the option to charge in their home because their home might be an apartment, condo, etc., where they don't have complete control over the home charging environment. The other thing that affects this is if you're not an EV buyer, there's really or owner, there's really no reason you should know where charging facilities are. When you actually buy the vehicle, voila, it pops up on your screen inside the car. The industry has frankly done a really poor job of explaining to that potential customer that just because you don't see EV chargers on every corner like you do gas stations, that they do in fact exist. Are there enough chargers to satisfy demand? Of course not. Is that changing? Absolutely. But that's a long process with a combination of private and public monies that will address that. So we're in this transition. And one thing I should say, we talk about cost of BEVs. What about costs of ICE vehicles? And part of this is consumer driven. Obviously, people want the people who buy new vehicles want a lot of content. They like the larger vehicles. It provides more capability, and obviously that costs more. And the industry is more than happy to oblige because that's higher profits. But when we talk about BEVs being too expensive, and we say, well, we need a $25,000 or $30,000 BEV. What about a $25,000 or $30,000 ICE vehicle? Good luck. They're out there, but that's not what the industry is appealing to because of the obvious focus on higher cost vehicles or higher price vehicles or higher profit.
Yep. Well, I think, and this is a unique situation that the automakers find themselves in. I would say that, when you think about the last 100 years, the auto industry was never responsible for fueling, really. I mean, they were, decide what are the specifications that the engine needs to run, and the oil industry produced the fuel that met those specifications and distributed it everywhere. And now we've got, a whole new model trying to take effect. So I think it's pretty reasonable that there's going to be lots of hiccups and things maybe be slower than folks might have expected, especially since there's so much reliance, on government policy here, and that has been slow to sort of get in gear and start to put the mass numbers of charging stations in place that would make BEVs more successful. So a lot of moving parts here for the transition, and anybody that's studied any kind of industrial history knows that changes like this don't happen overnight. And in the meantime, we all need to keep moving, working, going places, mobility, etc. So there is that continued reliance on the technology we have. I want to move on to our next to last topic here as we get close to the end of today's session. And just let's talk a little bit about fuel pricing and alternate fuels, Alan.
Well, the fuel pricing, we say, oh my gosh, it's so expensive to gas up your car. The next slide puts the lie to that. What it does is we see the green line, which is the nominal price. In other words, the price you see at the pump. The real price is the price adjusted for overall inflation. So, for example, we weren't paying $3.50 a gallon in 1974, but the 70 cents that we were paying in 1974, based upon the inflation trends over the years, would equate to a $3.25 charge. And so the blue line really becomes the one that's most relevant because it shows you putting that issue in play, that our fuel prices are in fact more or less in line with where we've been. Obviously, in the 80s and 90s, they were lower. But the point being, we're not in a period today where fuel prices are unreasonably expensive. They go up and down, and obviously we had that in the last couple years before the pandemic reduced volume or demand, and so they went down. But the point being that since these fuel prices are more or less in line with a long period, and this is in part due to a failure of gas taxes to increase. From a political standpoint, that's a very difficult thing to get done, at least at the federal level. And so, so consumers are saying, okay, I get this thing about BEVs. I've got some concerns about it, but I'm kind of comfortable. I obviously like to pay less, but it's not a real problem here. Give me some ice and I'll buy some gas.
Well, that is, and looking back at this chart here, I think those of us that can remember times when fuel prices were so low, it's really hard to imagine how that translates to today and all the different things that we have in vehicles that we didn't have back then as well. I think one of the issues that we wanted to touch on in the paper a little bit was the role of renewable fuels here, and I think that is a topic that maybe doesn't get as much airtime, but absolutely should. I think, for those that are studying the topic here, we have, last year, excuse me, in 2022, about 10.6 or so billion gallons of ethanol were part of our transportation motor fuel pool, and about 3.2 billion gallons of biodiesel and renewable diesel were part of that fuel pool as well. And these lower carbon intensity fuels offer a whole range of things. They've been used as a policy tool for obviously for helping to use more homegrown fuel and reduce our reliance on imported oil at a time. The use of renewable fuels as an oxygenate in the case of ethanol does provide air quality benefits during the ozone season, which is now in many parts of the US. So that's, I think, proven to be a big success. And on the diesel side, we haven't focused on that tremendously today, but certainly the opportunity to use more low carbon renewable biodiesel and particularly renewable diesel, which is a drop-in replacement for diesel, is substantial. And in fact, the Energy Information Administration, here in this graph kind of lays out for you what the prediction might be in terms of the volumes of that particular fuel that are coming online for capacity there. So I think just as we're seeing a great diversity in the kind of propulsion systems and vehicles that are available for consumers, we're also seeing a diversification of fuel types. And of course, electric plug-in is going to be a good option for many, but increasing the use of these renewable low carbon fuels across a wide spread of the internal combustion engine vehicle park. You think about, we've got 300 million existing internal combustion engines out there. If they all started using lower carbon intensity fuel at certain percentage levels, imagine the benefits that would start to accrue now on a very timely basis as compared to waiting until we get a full charging infrastructure build out, which is likely to take some time. So I think the opportunity for renewable fuels has been understated in the past, or maybe emphasized for different reasons, but in the future, I think there's likely to be more consideration for that as a strategy to help take the auto industry forward in what we're doing. I guess the last topic we wanted to talk about, Alan, was our old friend regulation, and there's sort of so much to speak about there. Maybe we can quickly address this and then have some time for some questions.
Well, I would put them in two buckets, and that is the EPA and NHTSA, particularly with their most recent regulations. The EPA is a little more restrictive, if you will, on the industry than the NHTSA regulations, which just came down in the last month or so. EPA about 2 or 3 months ago. And then the CARB, or California Air Resources Board, there's a significant difference between those two, the federal and the state. And of course, the California regulations are ascribed to by a variety of other states. The difference is California has a BEV requirement of a certain percent for its own state and the states that follow it. And you see from this graph, the ones that are the yellowish or whatever color we want to call that, is the most restrictive, or most covers the most ground, of these three categories. And so there's a smaller number of states that require that. Of course, like anything, this is subject to the court actions. The Biden administration permitted, if you will, California and the states that follow it to have their own regulations, which were more restrictive than the federal regulations. The industry and certain state attorney generals have gone to court to try to strike that down. As it stands today, of course, that is in play. And the California, the states that follow it, and there are actually a few more than what this chart shows, because it's a little more complex than being in these three categories, is 30% of the vehicle fleet of the country. So what it might result in, which some automakers have done, is kind of guiding where they send their BEVs and PHEVs. PHEVs are considered part of that meeting that requirement. Could that change? Absolutely. We obviously can't predict what the courts are doing. Even in that regard, the EPA is under court challenge, if you will, from a variety of sources. And obviously, a new administration is an issue as well. But what it suggests is that the ICE importance that we've talked about this whole presentation is still there, regardless of these regulatory situations. This would just kind of change the stringency, if you will, of those regulations if there were major changes at either the court or the administrative side.
Mm-hmm. I think just one observation on the regulatory climate, and it has been quite active. I think in the last first half of this year, we've seen more consequential regulations about vehicle emissions than in perhaps many decades, and ones that will certainly direct the future here. But also that even if we have a significant change in policy, a lot of the momentum that manufacturers have for all these products, for new internal combustion engine products, for battery electric products, those are not going to shift overnight based on what happens from a policy perspective. Those are manufacturing, and things are being built and made with parts and people. So they don't just vanish overnight if someone makes a change in a regulation. They continue to be part of a strategy until that strategy changes. So I think the regulation has presented us with kind of a path forward where folks are headed relative to reducing carbon and other emissions, and there are a range of different technologies and solutions to get there. Some states are making bold assessments about particular types of technology that they want to have, and others maybe are taking a different approach. So we'll definitely see the impact of regulation forever, as we always have, but it'll be interesting to see what happens the remainder of this year with the policies in place.
And remember, it's not just sticks, it's also carrots. And so there is, and of course, the industry is happy to accept those carrots, which are on the consumer side, but they're also on the manufacturing side. And so the industry is getting a lot of money, again, not just for BEVs, but for a range of technologies based upon those incentives.
Indeed, and again, the magnitude and the speed of which these changes are being sought really, demands a very high level of investments, perhaps on the order we haven't ever seen before. So that certainly makes sense. We have some time for some questions, and those have been submitted into the Q&A section of the website, of the meeting platform here. And I'll just maybe start off with a couple here. So the first question is, if there's a conflict in Asia, whether that's with PRC or Taiwan or People's Republic of China or Taiwan, et cetera, what effect will this have on BEV production? Any thoughts on that, Alan?
Well, it's a supply chain issue. You know, we're still very much dependent upon on China for both materials and in the case of LFP batteries, the lithium iron phosphate batteries are often made there. Now that's changing, and there's, you know, for example, in graphite, there's a movement to synthetic graphite, and there's movements in different types of lithium ion batteries, but and of course the Inflation Reduction Act has made a variety of changes with respect to both incentives and requirements to not use some of those vehicles, or some of those components rather. But that's in the next 2, 3, 4 years, and there have been some loopholes that have been used by the administration to try to handle that, to address that issue. But you know, conflict would obviously increase the demand for cutting off some of those sources, and that would be a problem. This is not something you can deal with quickly. These investments take years to localize and expand.
Indeed, absolutely. So we've got another question coming in here. It's while we're seeing improvements in ICE efficiencies, this participant is interested in hearing about a 2027 plus introduction of solid state batteries with a $65 per kilowatt hour cost and twice the energy density. So the evolution of battery technology is changing pretty rapidly. What's your take on that, Alan?
Well, solid state batteries are really interesting. Most of the automakers either are doing it themselves in terms of development, or they have joint ventures with companies that are specialists in the area. Toyota is a really interesting example because Toyota is obviously more resourced than most companies. They have said they're working very hard on it, but they've also said that in the 27-28 period where they expect them to be available in the market, they don't expect the volume to be very large because they don't think they will have solved the scale problem. So you know, they're obviously saying these are great batteries because of quicker to charge, less risk in fire. They're you know, you're not going to need as large of a battery, et cetera, et cetera. All those things, and you get away from some of the mineral constraints of sourcing and that kind of thing. But when Toyota itself says we're working really hard on this, but we're concerned that the volume's not going to be that great until you know, probably 2030, then you know, we realize that we've got some ways to go.
Absolutely. We have a handful of other questions here. One of them gets into what's the expected blend of fuel in the future, how much low carbon fuel will be in the market in the future. Any thoughts on that one?
Well, low carbon fuel, it's interesting because that's part of the California regulations. So, you know, even with California being obviously very oriented towards increasing BEV share in requirement, which tells you that even as they move to, in their current regulations, 100% BEV by 2035, they see the importance of low carbon fuel. I'm not an expert in that area, but it's certainly one the industry is utilizing, and utilizing in part because they have to from a regulatory standpoint. But it's obviously an opportunity with non-BEV vehicles.
Sure, I'll maybe add a few words to that. So California, Washington, and Oregon all have now low carbon fuel standards that require reducing the carbon intensity of the transportation fuel pool. New Mexico is the most recent state that just adopted a low carbon fuel requirement as well. And then New York has one under active consideration, somewhat like California's. So we are seeing states take some more action here that would accelerate the penetration of these alternate fuels, or I should say renewable fuels, into the mainstream fuel pool, but still at I would say fairly low percentages. Generally speaking, I think California's low carbon fuel standard peaks out at 22% of the volume, with then 78% or so being comprised of traditional petroleum-based fuel as a requirement in that particular state. So there's definitely a move afoot to push those further out. But I think, again, much like the situation with battery electric vehicles and scale, we have that same circumstance with renewable fuels, which is it's got a lot of demand and interest and opportunity for it today. It's just a matter of scaling up and getting more feedstock production and some of the more sophisticated refining processes in place. And the other thing that's important here as well as policy for renewable fuels, and that is a robust EPA renewable fuel volume set, which has not been the case in the past. And I think just earlier this week, the Clean Fuels Alliance America formally petitioned EPA for adopting a more robust 2026 renewable fuel set volume that's more in line with what production is doing today and what production can do in the next few years. So we've got a lot of opportunity on that renewable fuel side. Is it going to replace petroleum 100%? Hard to see that happening anytime in the near future, just as it's hard to see happening 100% battery electric vehicle in the near future. But I think, at the end of the day, you start to see where pockets and niches and fuels and technologies are going to become more of the commonplace than we have today. We're just over the hour here, and so I appreciate everybody who's staying on. But any final words, Alan, from you on all this? You've said a lot already, but anything else you'd like to add to kind of put a cherry on top of this?
I guess just the emphasis on the diversity of approaches, both from the automakers and therefore from the consumer. And of course, the consumer is led by the automaker. Consumers influence the automakers, but it does work the other way as well. And so, to the extent that the automakers have this multiple propulsion strategy approach, that really is going to carry the day. You obviously have some of the electric specialists, the Teslas, the Rivians, the Lucids, etc., around the world, and others around the world. They've had their ups and downs, but again, that's not going to be the way the market trends in its entirety by any means, because of the position of the existing automakers. Are the existing automakers going to lose some of their influence in this transition? Perhaps, but obviously not without a fight. And that goes back to the different requirements across industry. I mean, across continents and across sectors.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, very good. Those will be the final words. Thank you very much, Alan Baum from Baum and Associates, for your work in preparing this paper for us in today's presentation. Again, you can download that by clicking on the resource section of our website, of the Zoom control bar there. You can download the copy, or you can visit our website to do that as well. We appreciate any feedback that you might have about today's session. You can send us an email there. You can see it on your screen. Also, if you're interested in hydrogen for internal combustion engines, we've got just the program for you coming up on July 24th. Same time, different Zoom location, but we welcome your interest and participation in that. So again, thank you all for the time this morning, and thank you again, Alan, for your work and your insights and perspective in this area. Quite helpful. With that, we wish everyone a good day, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you again.